Weather, topography and fuel. Three factors that have long been known to affect both the behaviour and the spread of wildland fires. Published studies looking at the effect of these factors stretch back well beyond a century, while Indigenous knowledge stretches back far further. Yet questions still remain, and we still lack a fundamental physical theory to describe wildland flame spread through natural porous fuels. The work I'm describing today involves a series of laboratory-based flame spread studies conducted here at the Edinburgh Fire Research Centre and involving pine needle fuel beds typical of the sort of wildland fuel beds involved in surface flame spread. This work was conducted as part of a wider, SERDP-funded project conducted across multiple institutions and in both the lab and the field. One of the key focuses of this project is understanding the effect of fuel structure at multiple scales. We're interested not just in the effect this has on fire behaviour, but also on the underlying physical phenomena that control and drive this flame spread process. Why do we care about this? Well, our ability to include the effects of fuel structure within existing modelling approaches still remains a little lacking. For example, when it comes to commonly used empirical models, such as the Rothermel model, these often primarily consider the combustion that occurs within the primary flame front, rather than in the trailing combustion region. Even though we know from experimental observations that when we change the fuel bed compaction or packing ratio, we shift this combustion wave back so that more combustion occurs further behind the main flame front. Similarly, when it comes to physical models, there are questions about how we incorporate the fuel structure, particularly at the subgrid scale. For example, Mueller et al. Previously published some WFDS simulations of laboratory-based experiments similar to those that will be described today. This model showed a reliance upon the fuel structure which was not really representative of what was observed experimentally. For example, pine needle fuel bed of 11 kilograms per metre cubed bulk density was observed to self-extinguish, whereas experimentally, sustained flame spread was observed. This raises questions about how we're incorporating fuel structure and the physical mechanisms that vary as this fuel structure varies. It also underlies the need for further physical data to allow the future development and validation of these models. And that's what we'll look at today.
So welcome now into the Fire Lab, where we got rid of the effects of weather, topography, and focused on the effect of fuel structure. We did that using the flame spread table beside me here, and you might notice that this is similar to the sort of tables used in other previous laboratory-based flame spread studies. We've highlighted a few of these relevant studies within the paper itself, and have discussed how they've looked at a whole host of factors from wind speed and fuel moisture content to slope orientation, or even more complex geometries such as canyons, maybe the effects of interacting flame fronts. We've also tried to look at the distinction between natural porous fuel beds, such as the pine needle beds used in this study, and fuel beds composed from engineered materials such as wood cribs or excelsior. In this study, to look at the effect of fuel structure, we deliberately manipulated the fuel bed structure by varying the fuel loading and, either simultaneously or independently, the fuel bed height, thereby allowing us to also control the overall compaction or bulk density of the fuel bed. We were interested in the effect of these changes not only on the overall fire behaviour, but also on the physical phenomena that control and drive this flame spread process. And we wanted to look at these physical processes both above, but also within the porous fuel bed itself. So to look at all of that, we needed to employ a whole variety of instrumentation. Let's take a walk through that instrumentation just now. The table itself is 1.5 metres long by 0.67 metres wide, making it just over 1 metre squared in area. Either side of the table are these adjustable aluminium sidewalls, which were raised to a height just above the fuel surface to prevent lateral entrainment into the fuel bed. The inside surface of those sidewalls was also covered with an insulating fibre to reduce re-radiation from the sidewalls during each experiment. The table itself sits upon a load cell and underneath this large exhaust hood. This allowed us to measure both the heat release rate and the mass loss rate throughout the duration of the experiment. We provided full details on the calculations for both these methods within the paper itself. In terms of the other fire behaviour measurements, you see these distance markers along the front of the table and the flame height markers at the back. These give a quick qualitative estimation of the flame height and flame spread rate before we use video analysis for a more quantitative estimate after the experiment itself, using both side-on and overhead visual and IR imagery. So in addition to those fire behaviour measurements, you'll also notice a bidirectional pressure probe and an accompanying gas phase thermocouple situated on each of the flame height markers. This allowed us to measure the flow rate of the buoyant flow in the vertical direction above the fuel bed. These are located at a height of 1.2 metres, putting them above the actual flame region and within the convective plume region above that flame. We're also interested in the flow and the other physical processes within the fuel bed itself and in understanding how that changes as the structure of the porous fuel bed changes. So to do that, we had to employ some instrumentation within that porous fuel bed itself. Let's take a closer look at that just now. These in-bed measurement stations were located at a distance of 0.5 metres, 0.8 metres and 1.1 metres from the ignition line. They were all situated along the centre line of the fuel bed at a height of 10 millimetres above the table surface, locating them within the fuel bed itself. At each station was a gas phase thermocouple and also a bidirectional pressure probe, allowing us to measure the flow rate within the porous fuel bed and look at how this varied as that porous fuel structure was changed. For each experiment, ignition was in the form of a line ignition, using a thin strip of alumina-silica fibre across the entire width of the fuel bed, onto which we equally distributed 10 millilitres of acetone. Full details of this ignition source and its characterisation can be found within the paper itself. We conducted two separate experimental series, each using a slightly different species of pine needle. These were pitch pine and also pitch loblolly hybrid pine. Both of these species were shipped to us from New Jersey and allowed to air dry here in our lab prior to use. We took fuel moisture samples at the time of each experiment, and full details of these fuel moisture values, along with the thermophysical and geometrical properties of each pine needle species, can be found within the paper itself. Also included within the paper are further details on the construction of the fuel beds, how we ensured a good degree of uniformity, and the fuel bed's structural manipulations that were performed within this study. This involved altering the fuel loading, but also, either simultaneously or independently, the fuel bed height, thereby changing both the bulk density and the porosity or packing ratio. But let's spend a little bit of time considering what we mean by some of these structural terms like packing ratio and porosity, and what the physical implications might be. So we can construct a porous fuel bed from a number of thin fuel elements, such as the 300 grams of pine needles used in this example. This leaves us with a fuel bed of 15 centimetres in height and 22 kilograms per metre cubed in bulk density. We can also apply other common structural descriptors, such as porosity and packing ratio. Without altering the total number of fuel elements, or in other words keeping our fuel loading the same, we can vary the bulk density through compaction of the fuel bed. The example fuel bed now has a height of 8 centimetres and a greater bulk density, this time of 42 kilograms per metre cubed. But our fuel loading remains the same and is still 0.3 kilograms. Now that we've compressed the fuel bed, we've increased the packing ratio and decreased the porosity. This means that the average pore size between the needles is reduced and we're left with a much denser fuel bed. Now clearly there are physical implications that need to be considered as a result of these structural changes. For example, a more compressed, lower porosity fuel bed may exert greater drag forces, thereby reducing airflow through the fuel bed. This would lead us to consider any potential effects on oxygen supply or convective heating within the fuel bed. Similarly, the attenuation of radiation through the fuel bed might also be affected, and this could be directionally dependent, particularly if the needles have a preferential angle of inclination. If we now add more fuel, say another 200 grams of pine needles, then we can again increase the fuel bed height and return to our original fuel bed height of 15 centimetres. However, we're left with a very different fuel loading. We now have 500 grams of pine needles rather than the original 300 grams. But we know that the total fuel loading can also affect the spread rate of fire behaviour. So what does this mean for the use of terms such as porosity and bulk density in our prediction of fire behaviour? For example, within the construction of the Rotherwell model is the assumption of an optimum packing ratio, which is dependent only upon the fuel particle size. That is, a packing ratio at which the maximum reaction velocity and maximum fire intensity occur. But how do we tally this with the undefined effect of fuel loading that we've just been discussing? Indeed, Wilson of the US Forest Service later called for a requiem on the use of this term optimal packing ratio, having demonstrated in an extended series of experiments a dependence of the reaction velocity on fuel bed height or total fuel load. This has implications for the use of previously suggested non-dimensional parameters proposed as methods for correlating fuel bed structure with the flame spread rate. As far back as the 1940s,
Zakary and Fons suggested the use of a term which described the void volume of the fuel bed per fuel surface area. Subsequent dimensionless parameters of a similar form have also been proposed by further authors. The development of these dimensionless terms is described in greater detail in the paper, but these terms did not allow us to account for the independent changes in fuel loading and fuel bed compaction that we've just been discussing. Therefore, in this study, we introduce a slightly different term, a non-dimensional parameter alpha, sigma, delta, in order to incorporate these competing effects. In this term, alpha represents the porosity, sigma the surface to volume ratio, and delta the fuel bed height. In this study, we observed a correlation between this dimensionless parameter, alpha, sigma, delta, and the flame spread rate, as well as some other fire behaviour parameters. Let's take a closer look now at some of the fire behaviour results from throughout the study. As shown, the flame height and flame spread rate both changed markedly as the fuel bed structure was altered. Independent increases in fuel loading or decreases in bulk density led to increased rate of spread, as with previous studies. However, neither of these parameters alone was able to adequately explain the observed differences in fire behaviour. This is in contrast to the previously shown correlation between the rate of spread and the dimensionless parameter alpha, sigma, delta. Additional qualitative observations were also made across the fuel bed conditions. In each case, a clear flame front followed by a distinct trailing smouldering region were observable, except for the lowest fuel loading case, 0.2 kilograms per metre squared, in which case the smouldering region was absent. This was also the only fuel load condition at which a continuous flame front across the width of the fuel bed was not observed. Instead, it appears that at this low fuel loading, the sparse nature of the fuel means that needle-to-needle interactions start to dominate the flame spread process. To understand the significance of the fuel loading, the fuel surface area, and the void volume, we need to understand the physical phenomena. And in this study, we focused on understanding the effect of fuel structure on the flow regime. We're interested in two main flow regimes, the buoyant upward flow and the fire-induced entrainment flow through the porous fuel bed towards the approaching flame front. We observed that independent changes in either bulk density or fuel loading resulted in variations in the buoyant flow profile. In particular, we observed that increases in fuel loading led to an increased heat release rate and subsequently an increased buoyant flow velocity. We also saw that variations in the entrainment flow profile through the porous fuel bed occurred as this buoyant flow profile changed. There was an overall trend of an increasing mean entrainment velocity towards that approaching flame front as the fuel loading of the fuel bed increased. This underlies the need for further research on the subsequent effect of this variation in entrainment flow on the resulting oxygen supply and convective heat transfer within the combustion region, and on how this affects the overall flame spread process.
Since this work was completed, we've continued to look at the physical processes within this in-bed combustion region, particularly focusing on understanding the heat transfer mechanisms and how these vary as a function of the fuel bed structure. I look forward to sharing the results and findings from this work with you all very soon. In the meantime, I'd like to thank my co-authors from the University of Edinburgh and the US Forest Service, as well as CERDIC for funding this project under the grant RC2641. Thanks very much for watching.